So think about the scene with me, because there is something strange and amazing that happens in this passage in John chapter 2, right? The wedding at Cana in Galilee. So think about this scene with me. And it starts off simple enough. Jesus and his mother and his disciples go to Cana in Galilee for a wedding, and it's this social event. And some ancient sources tell us that the way it would work is that a wedding in the Jewish culture of the first century would be this multi-day affair, right? And at one point in this multi-day celebration, the families would walk as a procession to the groom's house, and there would be this great party. And maybe that's where they're at this moment. And it's a social event, friends and families, they're coming together, guests are arriving, the ceremony's been carried out, and this new couple is beginning their life together. They're celebrating in the groom's home, and then an emergency situation starts to unfold. They have run out of wine. Now, this is a real social problem. This is a faux pas that would not be forgotten for a long time. And that's not all that surprising. It was a miscalculation. Maybe the family was poor. Maybe they didn't have enough money to buy the exorbitant amount of wine that they needed. Maybe more guests arrived than they thought. Who knows? But something strange and unexpected happens. And we all know this story, right? Something strange happens. We all know what Jesus does. He turns the water into wine, and this is the first of his miracles. But what strikes me as strange and amazing and unexpected is what Mary, the mother of Jesus, does. And if you're following along, look at verse 5 in this passage, because Mary says to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Do whatever he tells you. And you got to be thinking, what you maybe wonder, what was Mary thinking, right? What did she think would happen in that situation? I mean, sure, she knew that her son, Jesus, was no ordinary man. I mean, his birth had been announced by angels and heralded by magi from afar, and she had found herself pregnant by miraculous means. And when John the Baptist was still in the womb and Mary went to visit Elizabeth, John leapt with joy. So Mary knew that this Jesus, her son, was someone special. He had been announced that he was filled with the power and the presence of the Holy Spirit. This air of holy power hung about him. But verse 11, this is the first of his signs, or his miraculous sign. It's Jesus' first miracle. Mary hadn't witnessed a miracle from Jesus before, or at least not one that's recorded in the Gospels. What did she expect would happen? And this is why Mary's words are so amazing and marvelous. She says, "Do whatever he tells you." She has placed her faith in Jesus even before she has witnessed him do a miracle, even before, as he puts it, his hour has come. Even before he has seemingly launched his world-tilting ministry, already Mary believes. And I think her words really set the tone for us in understanding this whole passage. The wedding at Cana, when Jesus turns the water into wine, it's not just an amazing miracle. It's Jesus cracking the doorway for his disciples, and really for all of us, to know him more deeply and to follow him more closely. This is a story about discipleship and wine, and it's about coming to the Lord and drinking deep from the cup of wine that is the wine of discipleship. And this is one of those passages, I don't know about you, but this is one of those passages that when I was growing up, it always struck me as kind of odd. I mean, first off, it's about a party where the wine runs out. And I read this, I read these words now, and I always wanted to kind of echo Jesus' words in verse 4, right? He says, "Why do you involve me?" Right? Or, "What is this to me?" Right? I mean, verse 4, and why does Mary worry about it? Right? What does it matter that the wine runs out? Why does she try to get Jesus involved? That always puzzled me. And Jesus' response puzzled me even more, because my question as a young person was, why does he keep the party going by providing more wine? Right? When I was growing up, going to a party and drinking wine, that was a very bad idea. I thought it was the road to ruin, and it can be. Some people tried to explain this passage to me by saying, well, Jesus, he didn't create wine as we think about it. Jesus created grape juice. But honestly, that's not going to fly, because the steward thinks that people can get drunk on wine, And he judges that the wine Jesus has miraculously brought into being to be very good wine indeed. So it would seem like it has that characteristic he was expecting of wine. So what's going on? And not only that, but Jesus seems a little bit brusque with his mother. Verse 4. Now, the NIV softens this a little bit, but verse 4, it says in NIV, "Dear woman, why do you involve me?" But actually in the Greek, it's quite straightforward. He just says, "Woman, what is this to me?" Right? And there's another time in the gospel that Jesus does this, where he calls his mother woman, because that is not really a normal way of addressing your mother. Usually you might speak of her as mother or dear mother, but there's another place in the gospel where he does this, and I wonder if taking these two passages together can kind of help us understand what's going on here. It's actually at the end of the gospel in 19:26, in John 19:26, Jesus is hanging on the cross. And he looks down and he sees his mother Mary and he sees John the disciple and he says, "Woman, here is your son." And the NIV translate that one too as "dear woman." But it's very straightforward. "Woman, here's your son." And at the beginning of his ministry and at the end, Jesus calls his mother Mary woman. Now, Jesus is a second Adam. Paul calls Jesus the last Adam who became a life-giving spirit. And in the story of Genesis, Eve is called woman. So there were a lot of ancient writers who thought about Jesus as the second Adam and Mary as this second Eve, this new Eve. And I wonder if there's something going on here where the new Adam who lives out his call perfectly, from the fruit of the vine to becoming the tree of new life on the cross, I wonder if the second Adam does that perfectly, and maybe so too does Mary, the new Eve. Seems like something might be going on here. Death came into the world when the first Eve and the first Adam ate of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, but now life comes into the world as the second Adam and the second Eve are faithfully obedient to God. And I wonder if that's kind of what Jesus is getting at when he says woman, right? Because, in Genesis, Eve is called woman. Sometimes translations even capitalize it, woman. And this is one of those stories, right, that there's something going on that's deep here, right? There's some symbolism. It's a story that's grown on me because the more that I sit with it, the more that I sense that there is some depth beneath the surface. And I kind of meditate on this passage, and I feel like there's something that I can't quite get a fix on, right? That I can't quite comprehend. It's a deep passage. And when we look at Scripture, there's often more than one level going on. There's the literal level, which is the straightforward level, and that's what happened. There it is. This is what it means. There's that literal level, but there's often also a symbolic level. And I think that's the case in this story. There is a literal meaning to what is going on, but then there's a symbolic level to what's going on too. Now, what happens in the literal level in this story is that there's this wedding that runs out of wine, and Jesus performs a miracle that saves the reputation of the host. And Jesus doesn't seem to want to get involved at first, but his mother kind of twists his arm, and she tells the servants to do whatever he tells you, and Jesus tells them what to do. There are 6 stone containers for water, for the Jewish rites of purification. It's the water for washing up when you would come into a house. And the jars are empty, right? The guests have all come in, the guests have all washed, the jars are empty. And Jesus tells the servants to fill those jars with water. And his miracle is very simple and straightforward in this way. There's no waving of his hands. There's no calling down the power of God. He just says, now draw out some of the water, take it to the master of the banquet. That's it. And it's wine. The master of the banquet, the MC, the chief steward, he takes a taste, and then in verse 10 he says these famous words, everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink, but you have saved the best till now. That is what literally happened. And on this basic literal level, this is about Jesus showing a kindness to this young married couple and their family. They would have been embarrassed, and now they're not. They would have been shamed, but now they are honored because they have been seen to have saved the best wine for last. It is a story of caring in a very human predicament. It also says something about Jesus' relationship with his mother. At first, Jesus rebuffs her concern. He says, what has this to do with us? Right? In other words, I got bigger fish to fry. It's not yet his hour. And his hour in the Gospels is this time when Jesus will suffer and die and be raised for the salvation of the world. And so he's sort of saying to Mary, why are you worried about these people running out of wine? Don't worry about saving the party. I've got the world to save here, right? And it's Mary who intercedes with her son to get him to take action. But there's also something symbolic going on in this passage. There's a deeper meaning to the water and the wine. You see, wine in the scriptures is often a symbol of abundance. In the Old Testament, when Isaac is on his deathbed, he blessed Jacob, saying, "May God give you of the dew of heaven and of the fatness of the earth and plenty of grain and wine." And later, Jacob blesses his sons on his deathbed. And in words that are prophetic of Jesus the Messiah, he says of Judah, right, the tribe from which Jesus came, he says that Judah will bind his foal to the vine and his donkey's colt to the choice vine. And he washes his garments in wine and his robe in the blood of grapes. His eyes are darker than wine and his teeth whiter than milk. In the Psalms, sometimes the wine is the wine of God's wrath, but in the Proverbs, God's wisdom lays out her table and invites all to come and share in the knowledge and wisdom that she offers. It's symbolized by bread and wine. She says, "Come, eat of my bread and drink of the wine that I have mixed." And of course, in Jesus' own life, wine and bread are deeply symbolic because the bread is the body and the wine is the blood of the new covenant. And he says in John 6 that he is the bread come down from heaven. And he says in John 15 that he is the true vine. And here we are at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. The very first miracle that Jesus performs is about multiplying wine at this festival banquet. And among other things, it is a miracle of abundance. I mean, just do the math. Each of those 6 stone jars holds 20 to 30 gallons. And even I can handle this math, right? That means that on the low end, Jesus has just provided this party with at least 120 gallons of wine. And by any count, 120 gallons of wine is a lot of wine. The ancient Hebrew prophets had been anticipating that at the coming of the Messiah, in the Messianic age, God would pour out a tremendous abundance. And Amos said, "The mountains shall drip sweet wine, and all the hills shall flow with it." And here we are. John doesn't just call it a miracle, he calls it a sign, because it points beyond itself. It's a symbol, a sign of something greater. It points to God's wisdom, to God's abundance, to God's joy, to Jesus' own blood that's going to be poured out on the cross, to the abundance of the Messianic age. This water turned to wine in so many ways really sets the tone for all of Jesus' ministry. He's going to have this water to wine kind of a ministry. He's going to have this abundant ministry, this ministry of celebration, a ministry where ultimately his own blood is shed and poured out as wine for the lives of the world. And what draws both the literal and the symbolic senses together is Mary, her words and her belief. She says to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." And she believes that Jesus will lead them rightly in that moment. Mary's words are an invitation to know Jesus more deeply and to follow him more closely. And I'm going to take this in reverse because, the follow seems obvious enough, right? She says to him, "Do whatever he tells you." And it's this call to obedience, right? The servants, they get it. It's this call to be following him more closely. So the servants get it. Do you want us to fill these jars with water? Sure, why not, right? No skin off our backs. But I wonder first off, how often in our own lives we're able to hear that call to do whatever Jesus tells us, right? To follow wherever Jesus is leading. I wonder how often we're able to pay attention in our own lives. I mean, do we pay attention to the ways that Jesus is speaking to us? Are we listening for Jesus leading, which in this particular case comes indirectly, right? Through Mary. Jesus isn't the one urging the servants on. It's Mary who's doing the talking. And in our own lives, sometimes it's like this, right? In the tension of the moment, when it feels like everything is falling apart, it can feel like Jesus is not involved or doesn't care, has nothing to say about the situation. What does this have to do with me? But here's Mary placing her faith in Jesus, the one she believes does care, is present, and will do something. This is one of those things when I think about our own lives, right? This is one of those things that strikes me about the work of hospital chaplains. And I don't know if you've bumped into hospital chaplains much in your experience, but I really admire them. It's work that I think is so challenging. I mean, they're people, hospital chaplains, who walk in on trauma after trauma, loss after loss, right? Broken lives and broken relationships. And they sit with one family, and then they go down the hallway and come into another situation, right? And they'll tell you, if you talk to a hospital chaplain, they'll tell you sometimes they wonder where God is, what God is doing, if God is going to show up. And that kind of work would personally not be for me, because not so much because of the trauma that they encounter, but because I think it'd be hard to not have that long-term relationship, to not have a chance to glimpse how God shows up in people's lives over the long term, how God is involved in healing. Because in that line of work, all you're doing is seeing people on their worst day. You don't get to see the other parts. And here's the situation at the wedding in Cana. And I wonder if it kind of feels like that in our lives sometimes, right? Is Jesus here? Does he care? Is he going to do anything? And Mary is the one who takes a leap of faith, really, and she entrusts her whole life to her son. She says, do whatever he tells you. Can we hear those words? They're words of obedience. They're words of trust. They're words of confidence. In the midst of a confusing and trying situation, are we willing and able to do whatever Jesus tells us? It has to mean, first off, that we think he's telling us something. And maybe that comes as a stretch to you. I don't know. Maybe you're not sure that Jesus is telling you something. But we know that Jesus has taught his way in the Gospels. He's preached the Beatitudes. He taught through parables, and he spoke examples. He engaged in dialogue and debate with the religious leaders of the day. The story of Jesus' words and actions in his earthly ministry, that's what we call the gospel. And it's good news. We have this record that we can live by. We have his words, and then we can read them, and we can study them, and hear them, and chew them over. And the Gospels aren't just words that Jesus spoke to others. They are words that Jesus speaks to us. And so we can hear Mary's command as a word to us. Do whatever he tells you. Read the Gospels and do it. Live out the words of Jesus. Make them part of your life. And it's true, Jesus didn't address every situation. They are not that kind of words. They're not rigid words. Jesus' words and way are meant to be taken into our lives and our hearts so that we can go on and live out and live by those words, so that we can walk in his way according to our own shoes. There's this improvisational quality about following Jesus, this kind of jazz of discipleship that is the opposite of rigidity. But so too, we do whatever Jesus tells us in our own particular situations, in our own lives. What is Jesus saying to you? Where is Jesus leading you? What is Jesus asking you to do? Do whatever he tells you. Have you ever had one of those situations where you feel like Jesus is telling you to do something? I have. I'm guessing you have too. And it may be audible, but there can also just be this moment where you feel like God is laying something on your heart and that you have to respond to it. You simply cannot say no to it. It's a matter of conscience. And sometimes you feel that deep in your bones. Do whatever he tells you. You see a situation and you have to act regardless of the consequences. And there's something that's compelling you, something that is speaking to you, something that is driving you. And sometimes that can be Jesus leading you to follow him. And that drive can be the drive to discipleship. Have you ever felt that? Do whatever he tells you. And sometimes we need someone to come alongside us and to help us hear the voice of Jesus. Sometimes we're those servants. And we need Mary to say, hey, do what he's saying. Listen to him, right? Pay attention to Jesus. I know that's been my experience, right? Sometimes I won't recognize the voice of God in my own life until someone comes alongside of me and helps me hear it, helps point out God's voice. And you see this in the scriptures. Think about old Eli helping young Samuel recognize the voice of God. So Samuel, He's this kid. He's awake at night, and he hears a voice saying, Samuel, Samuel. And he runs to Eli, thinks it's got to be Eli who's calling him. I mean, who else? And after a couple of times, Eli recognizes that, in fact, it is God who is calling Samuel. And he sends Samuel back to bed and says, if he speaks again, say this, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. Or in the New Testament, think about Ananias, who helps Saul to recognize that it was Jesus who confronted him on the road to Damascus, and it is Jesus who is calling Saul into service. Saul was blind and silenced, fasting for 3 days before Ananias came to him and spoke to him and prayed over him and said, Brother Saul, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on your way here, has sent me to you so that you may regain your sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit. Do you hear? Do you understand? And that's what Mary is doing here. She is helping the servants, and by extension, Jesus' disciples, because they're there too. She's helping them to hear what Jesus is saying to them. And we need people like that in our lives, right? People who can help us to tune in to the voice of Jesus. Now, of course, there's also people who actually will do the opposite, people whose very presence can kind of shut down or diminish our ability to hear the Lord. And sometimes we got to get a little bit of distance from those folks. But what a treasure. What a treasure it is to find someone, a friend, a relative, a brother or sister from the church who can help us tune in to what Jesus is saying. Do you have someone like Mary in your life? Do you know someone who can help you hear what Jesus is saying to you, even in situations of confusion and hardship? And I hope you have someone like that. Someone who knows how to listen deeply and to help you hear the voice of Jesus through the din of life's chaos. Now, sometimes it's a person who we have never met. Many of the people who have been most influential for me and helped me to hear the voice of Jesus are writers. And I know them through their books. The late, great Eugene Peterson was one of those folks. And I discovered his books when I was learning the art of pastoring. And even though I never got to meet him in person, Dr. Peterson spoke with a wise, firm, kind voice that helped to point me to the voice of Jesus. Now, the second piece in this story of the water to the wine is that Jesus leads us to know him more deeply. So we follow him more closely, and we are led to know him more deeply. And Jesus leads us, and at the end of this encounter, you see this in verse 11. At the end of this encounter, you see that John makes this comment. The writer of the gospel, he says, verse 11, his disciples believed in him, or they put their faith in him. And that's kind of a funny thing to say, right? His disciples put their faith in him. Because in order to be his disciples, didn't they already have to have faith in him, right? Didn't they already believe in him? I mean, isn't that sort of the point of discipleship, right? That you believe in Jesus? And I think that what happened is that these disciples witnessed the event, this first miracle, and its meaning began to dawn on them slowly. They came to know Jesus more deeply through it. Because this miracle of turning water into wine says something about the nature of Jesus. And that's what we were noticing earlier. It's this act of love for the family hosting the feast that reveals something about the heart of Jesus. And there's also this symbolism that speaks about the abundance of Jesus' ministry. And I think that started to dawn on them, right? That this what just happened, this wine, is a symbol of God's wisdom. It's a symbol that's of God's love. It's pointing to something beyond itself. It's pointing even to Jesus' love poured out for the life of the world. And they started to realize, the disciples, there's this richness going on. There's this abundance. They realize, like the steward, that the best wine has been saved for last. And I think in this way, the wine really becomes a symbol of discipleship. Later on, Jesus will say to James and John, can you drink from the cup that I am going to drink? And yes, it is the cup of suffering. It's the cup of cross-bearing. But it is also the cup of God's abundant blessing. It's the wine of discipleship. And so maybe what we have to do is to kind of put ourselves into this story. We have to enter into this scene with Jesus and see the water that ran clear darkening and swirling outward in the color of crimson. We have to experience Jesus' abundant something coming out of what seemed like a nothing situation. We have to drink the cup that is offered to us. It's just a taste of things to come. And this cup, this wine, is an invitation. Jesus is asking in this moment if we are willing to know him more deeply and to follow him more closely. This is the first of Jesus' signs according to the Gospel of John. And what that means, it's the first. There are others. There's healing and walking on water. There's the multiplying of the loaves. And most people will go through the Gospels and count up 7 signs in the Gospel of John. And this first sign of abundance and love, it really opens the way for the other signs. And the last sign, the resurrection of Lazarus, or possibly Jesus' own resurrection as a sort of 8th sign, those last signs of resurrection, they really encapsulate them all. But there's a way in which the sign of water to wine, the invitation to drink the wine of discipleship, this wine of knowing Jesus more deeply and following him more closely, there's really a way in which this points the way of healing and life, the way it points to multiplication and ultimately resurrection. The water transformed to wine, this first sign of Jesus' ministry, points through to the last sign, to resurrection. And so I think there is an implicit question in the transformation of water to wine. And the question is this: are you ready for Jesus to turn water to wine in you? Right? It's a question for each one of us. Are you ready to experience this transformation in your life? Because to drink the wine is to be transformed. And so are you ready to have the water of your life, the water of your faith, the water of your heart turned into rich wine? And you see in this way, the water to wine is really a metaphor of discipleship. It's this walk with Jesus right here, right now. And Jesus is saying elsewhere that his message and his ministry, he says they're new wine, and they got to be placed in new wineskins. And so the question is, are you ready to have common water turned into extraordinary wine in your own life? This story lays the groundwork for Jesus' ministry, for the shape of the disciples' faith. And it tells us that no matter the confusion or the opposition or the hardship, that they will always be able to remember back to that water that turned into wine. They'll remember that abundance, that power, that goodness, that celebration. And indeed, in John's gospel, there is immediately after this conflict, because it's in John's gospel, they go to the temple, and Jesus overturns the tables of the money changers. He drives out the animals with the whip, and their faith is immediately tested. Their transformation is continued. And the disciples are going to have another opportunity to sip from the cup of the wine of discipleship. But I think, like them, the question is always coming back to us, to you. What about you? Are you ready for water to be turned into wine in your own life? Are you ready to drink from Jesus' transformative cup? Amen.